Episode 2 The Exile. Exile Natalie raised her head and bit her lip. She was so angry that she couldn't utter a single word. Her whole body was trembling with fury. She couldn't understand why Cheryl would ruin her life like this. Cheryl smiled. So what if you are angry? Cheryl played with her curly hair and she sneered. Nick doesn't believe you. Your father doesn't believe you either. You can go abroad and live on your own. Natalie was furious. Why are you doing this to me? Why are you running with my life? Why? She rushed forward hysterically and wrapped her hands around Cheryl's neck. But Cheryl didn't resist. She only blinked pitifully at her. Sister, don't hurt me. Last night really wasn't my fault. What are you doing? Hearing the commotion, Tom rushed out, looking so angry that the veins on his neck stood out. He raised his hand and pushed Natalie to the ground. Are you crazy? Are you trying to kill your sister? Natalie fell to the ice-cold sidewalk, where she remained, unable to bear the pain any longer. She was on the verge of tears. She thought of her mother and her childhood. But no matter how hard she wished, she could never return to that time. Rosemary, her stepmother, came up behind her. When she saw the marks on her daughter's neck, she was so angry, just like her husband, that she raised her hand and slapped Natalie. You uneducated brat! You are just the same as your mother. You might as well die. The more she slapped, the harder each slap became. Tom stood beside her, but he only seemed to be concerned about Cheryl's injuries. As the attack went on, Natalie's vision grew blurry from the blows, but all she could feel was the coldness in her heart, as if all warmth had left it. At that time, in his office at the Clare Group, Bruce was looking at his assistant with a malicious expression. What's going on? His face was so gloomy that his gaze could bore holes through a person. How is the investigation going? His assistant was sweating under his gaze, but he swallowed and told him the news. It's Evan Wilson. Bruce knew of Evan. A while ago, he had worked with a Clare Group on a project and had taken many kickbacks from it. Bruce didn't like his way of handling things, so he had sent his men to destroy the Wilson family. Right now, the Wilsons were on the verge of bankruptcy and collapse. Evan bribed the hotel's waiter and drugged you. He probably wanted to use this too. The assistant's voice trailed off until he was no longer breathing. So that the situation was clear now. Evan was behind all this. Bruce had never thought that something would go wrong and that would have to completely deviate from his original plan. I checked. Evan booked a room in the hotel last night. The assistant looked up at him assistantly, that looked down again. But you didn't use it. Bruce's expression suddenly changed and he asked in a low voice, What do you mean? The assistant was confused. He could only look at his face and repeat hesitantly, You didn't use the room yesterday? If he didn't go in his room, then who was the woman who had been lying on his bed? In his mind, he saw broken images of her flushed cheeks and her body writhing beneath him. But what he remembered clearest what were those cries of grief and heartbreaking pain. He suddenly remembered the crimson spots on the sheets that he had noticed before he left. The woman had been a virgin. Bruce's brows knit together. He told his assistant in a deep voice, Go check the identity of the woman who was in my room immediately. He wanted to know where she had become from. The assistant immediately hurried off to do as had been told, but no matter how fast he moved, he wouldn't be able to find any useful information. The hotel's surveillance tapes had already been wiped by Chiral. How could she possibly leave behind evidence that would show that she had set Natalie up? Naturally, she had to cover her tracks. After doing this, she continued to pretend that she was innocent and gloated as she watched Natalie get kicked out of her house in a sorry state. Natalie didn't even stay a night before she was packed off, sent out of the country. She lugged her heavy luggage onto the plane. She had been exiled without knowing when she could return. Episode 3, You Are My Daddy. You Are My Daddy 5 years later. Natalie stood in a first-class lounge of Heathrow Airport, staring at the 2 tickets in her hands, unable to focus. She had been in England for 5 years, and all the time, she hadn't made even one phone call to her family. Her father treated her she was dead, and if he couldn't care less about it. If it wasn't for Cheryl and Nick's engagement, he might not even have remembered she existed. Her heart had no attachment to the place she had been separated from the 4 years. All her feelings had been erased on the day was thrown out. She didn't even want to go back and see the people who had hurt her. But she couldn't stand listening to her father's threats on the phone. If she did not do what he said, he would not let her grandmother live peacefully. He could even hurt her. Her grandmother was the closest person in the world to her. She had wanted to bring her to England to spend the rest of her life there, but she couldn't sway the old lady from her desire to be in the country where her husband and daughter had lived. Natalie had no choice but to live where she was. If it wasn't for her grandmother, she probably wouldn't go back to the rest of her life, but she couldn't afford to lose her to her father's thoughts. Mommy, Mommy, lost in her thoughts, she suddenly heard a lovely voice beside her. She looked down and saw a 4-year-old boy lightly tugging at the corner of her jumper. He told her in a serious tone, "Stop daydreaming. The plane is about to take off." Only then did she recover her wits. The anger in her eyes gradually softened as she smiled and picked up the child. "All right then, let's go to the gate." At the same time, on the other side of the first-class lounge, a tall man in a suit with 2 burly bodyguards standing behind him strode towards the gate in a cold expression. Natalie had bought first-class tickets. In the past few years, she had suffered a lot from feeling rootless in a foreign country, and she had developed many issues. She had bad insomnia and headaches. She had afraid. She was afraid of loud noises. The moment she got on the plane, she covered her eyes with a blanket to try to fall asleep. But first, she told Liam to be good and not run around. Liam was her precious treasure. He was very well behaved. He sat on his seat as he was told and played with a toy she had bought him. Occasionally stealing glances at her, Natalie put her head against the window. He soon noticed that she didn't look well. "Mommy?" He leaned across and looked at her. Seeing that she was frowning, he asked worriedly, "Are you not feeling well?" Natalie coughed twice due to an itch in her throat. With a hint of weakness in her voice, she answered, "I'm fine." She looked at the child and forced to smile. I'm just a little thirsty. Without waiting for her to say anything, Liam jumped out of his seat and hurried off excitedly to get her some water. She didn't know who he took after. He was only 4 years old, but he was so sensible as a small adult, and he could even take care of her. Liam came running back with a glass of water. As he reached their seats, he bumped into a man who had just stepped into the plane. The glass in his hand wobbled, and the water spilled from it, wetting the man's shoes and the legs of his pants. Bruce lowered his head and looked at the water stains on his clothes. He frowned in displeasure. "What are you doing? Don't you know to watch where you're going?" "I'm sorry." Liam held the cup of apologize repeatedly. But when he raised his head and looked at the man, he was immediately stunned. "I'm Liam," had once finally misrode the courage to ask his mother about his father. Natalie was taken aback and stood speechless for a moment before she randomly showed the young boy a picture of a handsome man and told him that this was him. Looking at Bruce, Liam instantly somehow recalled the same picture and realized that the two men resembled each other to almost a fault. Bruce was a well-built man who possesses a muscular demeanor and suave gait. His pose and grace made the young boy quiver. The more he looked at Bruce, the more he felt that the man in front of him fit his image of his father from a picture. He stood quiet for 2 seconds before hurling himself at Bruce, long leg, and then shouted, "Daddy!" The two bodyguards behind Bruce were completely taken aback by the scene falling in front of them. They had been with Bruce for a long time, but this was the first time they've seen someone who acts so affectionately with them, let alone someone so young. Bruce's expression instantly turned ugly. He reached out his hand to push the little arms that were wrapped around him and said coldly, "Don't randomly call people your father. I am not your father." He had known many women who had claimed to be pregnant with his child, but this was the first time he had ever seen as a clever as affectionate son. Liam stared at his face and answered with certainty, "You are my daddy. Why did you abandon me and mommy?" And the more he spoke, the more wronged he felt. He pouted his small mouth and put on a pitiful expression. When the passengers behind them heard this, they immediately looked over in curiosity. Natalie couldn't sleep through the commotion. She opened her eyes and looked in the direction of the noise, only to find her son standing in the middle of the aisle, holding onto the leg of the unfamiliar man. Sorry, she quickly got up, embarrassed. She reached out to take the child's hand. He must have made mistaken. "Liam, let go of him." Her son always been sensible and listened to her over anyone else. But today she didn't know what was going on. No matter how much she tried to pursue him, Liam continued to hold on his leg of that strange pants man. He bit his lips in frustration, refused to let go. Bruce was a cold person, but when he looked at the child's pitiful expressions, he felt a bit moved. He frowned and said to Natalie, "Why did you become a mother? If you couldn't give him a complete family, it would have been better not to have him at all." Episode 4, You Make Me Sick. "You make me sick," the man's words stuck like a fish bone in her throat, mercilessly and viciously piercing Natalie's sore spot. What had happened on the fateful night was not her fault, and she had only found out that she was pregnant after she went abroad. She didn't even know the man from that night and who had done this to her, much less what she would do. After a long period of indecision, She had finally mustered up the courage to have the child. She had never regretted it, and she did not feel that someone she had never met could blame her for it. Sorry, but that's none of your business. Her expression immediately turned cold, and she enunciated every word very clearly. He just accidentally spilled water on you and mistook you for someone else. You don't have the right to speak to me like that. She stared at the man in front of her with a fierce gaze and added, I can teach my own child. I don't need you to give him a lesson. You can teach your child, Bruce scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Since his mother, like you, I'm afraid he'll end up spoiled. Natalie clenched her fist and tightly pursed her lips. She took a cup of water off Liam's hand and threw it in the man's face. The water slid down to his skin. Seeing his shocked expression, she smiled coldly. Well then, I really must thank for your son, for your concern. She ignored the fuming man. Pick up your child and return to your seat. After that had happened, Liam was in a low mood. Natalie's heart ached to see him like this. She didn't know what had possessed him to hug a stranger's leg and call him daddy. Liam happened to just now shrieked and gently ruffled the hair on his forehead. Why do you call him daddy? She asked softly. Liam looked up and blinked at her. He is my father. I knew it. I can feel it, he insisted. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He could feel that the man was his father. All right, you. She poked his forehead and said seriously, don't mess around anymore. Do you hear me? Fortunately, the rest of the flight was uneventful and she did not see the man again. As she led Liam out of the airport, she bumped into Cheryl's neck, who had come to pick her up. Long time no see. Cheryl held Nick's hand and smiled, leaning on his shoulder. I really miss you. Natalie thought that she no longer felt anything for them. But after seeing this, the hatred in her heart skyrocketed. And is that so? She replied coldly. Looking at Cheryl's smug expression, she felt disgusted. Liam, who had been sitting on his luggage, looked out curiously from behind Natalie's legs. He saw Cheryl's neck and asked, Who are they? Cheryl was so shocked when they saw a child. She had been so focused on flaunting her feelings in front of Natalie that she didn't notice him. Yes, before she could finish, Natalie replied calmly, This is my son, Liam. Son? How did she get son? Cheryl had countless questions in her mind. She hadn't even heard that Natalie was married, so where I had came from. Sis, you're so mean. She nudged Natalie and said with a smile, You didn't even tell us you get married. 5 years before, Cheryl had pretended to be innocent and wrong so that she could play the victim. Now she was affectionately calling her sis as if they had deep sisterly affection for each other. She was really very talented actress. Natalie watched her performance and disgust in her heart almost reached its limit. Since it come to this, what's the point in pretending? How can you look at yourself and not feel sick? You make me sick. The moment she finished speaking, Nick, who had been standing beside his fiancée without saying anything, shouted angrily, Why do you bother with her, Cheryl? She did so many shameless things in the past. This child might even the illegitimate son of that man.